Good morning. My name is Marson Nance. I'm Director of Land Protection and Stewardship for the Northwest Arkansas Land Trust, and we are at Wilson Springs Preserve today. Wilson Springs Preserve is owned and managed by Northwest Arkansas Land Trust. It's a 121-acre wet prairie and wetland here right in the heart of urban north side of Fayetteville, between Sam's Club and the old Razorback Golf Course off of Dean Solomon Road. We've been working since about 2014 to restore the site to native tallgrass prairie and oak savanna. Historically, this was all tallgrass prairie in this whole area here, and had been farmed for quite a long time. The good thing about this particular property, though, is it had never been plowed. And so when a prairie area is plowed, the root systems of native plants and seed banks are very disturbed, and so you get a decrease in biodiversity. And so this property had cattle on it for a long time and was hayed, and then it was kind of let go. And when you let an open system like this go, it wants to convert to forest. And so you get a lot of early successional tree species in here that get very dense, and they tend to crowd out a lot of our native grasses and forbs and wildflowers and things. And so what we're trying to do out here is thin out a lot of the woody plants to bring back the native grasses and wildflowers that were once here. Wilson Springs is it's at the headwaters of Clabber Creek. We're in the Illinois River watershed. It's very important for water quality in the watershed. Because it is a wet prairie and wetland, it acts as a sponge to kind of filter stormwater, remove pollutants from the water and nutrients before they reach Clabber Creek and ultimately into the Illinois River. So the property here takes in about 900 acres worth of stormwater, and which is quite a lot for a 100-acre property, but it's very important, serving that ecological service of cleaning water before it reaches our waterways. Wilson Springs is named for Steve Wilson, who was a biologist for the Arkansas Transportation Division. He discovered Arkansas darters, which is a tiny little streamfish in a spring that actually exists now in the interchange loops on I-49 over here, kind of at the interchange of I-49 and 112. We named the property for him because he did discover those fish there in that spring, and he figured out a way to protect the spring and protect the fish while allowing the infrastructure that was so badly needed as far as the highway goes. Arkansas darters were first discovered in the state in 1979 here on this property, so it's a very important site for the history and our ecological knowledge of that fish species. The Arkansas darter is a species of greatest conservation need in Arkansas. It was once listed as a candidate for endangered species listing federally, but it is pretty abundant throughout its range in the Arkansas River basin, but it's not very abundant in northwest Arkansas. We do survey for that fish here every year. We have fish here every year, thank goodness. That's what we like to see. Our conservation efforts are working to protect that species and keep the population here viable. So the major point of restoration here at Wilson Springs Preserve is to convert this old field and this overgrown forest back into native tallgrass prairie. Native tallgrass prairie is one of the most threatened ecosystems in North America. A lot of scientists suggest that only 1% of its hundreds of thousands of acres of extent are still present in North America. And so these little patches of prairie are very important because they're preserving our natural history and our biodiversity in the region. Tallgrass prairies were typically maintained by large herbivores like bison, who roamed around the land and ate the grasses and plants and kept the woody plants at bay, and also by fire. Both lightning caused fire, and the Native Americans actually used fire too as a management tool to keep these areas open. Native Americans realized that these areas with sparse trees and large grasslands were really good for grazing animals, which they like to eat. So they used fire as a tool to actually keep the area open. By doing that, they actually preserved the prairie for us. Prairies are they're so imperiled because they tend to be the easiest to build on, right? They're the flattest areas. The soil tends to be pretty tillable. So we convert them to agriculture, which most tallgrass prairies have been, but we also develop on them, housing complexes and shopping centers, all that kind of stuff, which we need in a growing area like Northwest Arkansas. But you know, every time we we mow over a place and pave it, put houses and stuff on, we lose a little bit of that natural character of the landscape. And so what the Land Trust and a lot of our other organizations do is they try to preserve and restore these areas so that we have these for future generations, and then so we don't forget what, you know, the Ozarks and Northwest Arkansas, you know, what it was. So we're standing here at about a 5-acre tract that we cleared a couple years ago. We're trying to convert a lot of the property back to native tallgrass prairie. We basically timber mulched this site, which means we took big heavy machines and we cut down a lot of trees. Most of the trees we took down were actually Callery pear or Bradford pear, which are an invasive species. And there's actually a bounty on them through the city of Fayetteville right now to return a Bradford pear and get a native tree in its place. And behind us, along the edges of this meadow out here, you can see these white trees, these white flowers that are in bloom. Those are all Callery pear in the background. And so this area was predominantly that. And so this was the first real area that we actually cleared and opened up to restore these tall grasses and wildflowers. We get a lot of milkweed in here throughout the summer. We get a lot of bidens. In September, the place is completely covered in bright yellow flowers. It's absolutely gorgeous. But this is sort of representative of what we'd like to see around a lot of the property. We're taking down a lot of trees, primarily green ash and cedar and the Callery pear that I mentioned. We're also working to remove other invasive species like bush honeysuckle and Chinese privet and multiflora rose, which create these really dense thickets. They're not real fantastic for wildlife or biodiversity for the site. So by removing all this woody stuff, we allow sunlight to reach the ground. And by allowing the sunlight to reach the ground, that kind of wakens up the native seeds that are there and gives them a chance to come on up. And that's really what we want to see. But this site in particular gets really birdy at certain times of the year. Northwest Arkansas Master Naturalists, they have bluebird boxes out here that are often occupied by tree swallows and Carolina chickadees, a lot of cool birds out here. We get a lot of hawks and owls. Here on Clabber Creek, we get a lot of blue herons and green herons, kingfishers, a lot of cool birds out here. So if you like a bird, this is a great place to come. So we talk a lot about invasive and non-native species, exotic species. And so, you know, kind of the real difference in them is our native species are species that are supposed to be here. They're native to our area, they're native to our region, and they're the plants that historically were always here. A lot of our invasive species are exotic species. That means they come from completely different areas of the world even. Bush honeysuckle and Chinese privet, those are Asian species, and they were planted primarily as ornamentals. They're very pretty. Privet acts as a really nice hedge. People plant them in their yards. The problem with them is they're easily transported around the region by birds and other wildlife who are eating the seeds and then dispersing those seeds. And what happens is when you get a lot of these invasive species in an area, they're very well adapted to outcompete other species, in particular our native ones that we want to be here. All our insects and wildlife and everything kind of evolved in this region and co-evolved with these plants that were always here. And the invasive species come in, they crowd out, they shade out, they take over the system. And that prevents wildlife movement. It decreases the biodiversity of the plants there, so there's not as much food for pollinators and other animals that are dependent on these resources. And so we do a lot of work to control invasive species and also just educate people about removing them and not to plant them in their yards in the first place. So here at Wilson Springs, we do have about 2 miles of public access trail. You can access the trailheads from the Sam's Club parking lot. There's also a neighborhood walk-in entrance off of Dean Solomon Road. So right now we're working on the trails and doing some rehab, putting in some wet weather crossings. But we do have some pretty cool stuff out here, including some art installations. As part of our grand opening a couple of years ago, we had some art installations put in. This one right here is called Poppy Seed by Stuart Fulbright. It's made of native river cane, which is pretty fantastic. And it kind of serves as a bird and duck blind. You can get back in here and peek through the cane a little bit and actually see ducks in the wintertime along Clabber Creek in there. So it's very cool. We've also got another sculpture down the trail by Ann Edmondson, Cattails. It's an iron piece, which is pretty awesome. And then another one by Emily Baker that actually represents the amount of water that this wetland actually collects. So pretty cool, interesting art pieces you see out here. We got really easy walking trails, although it is really wet right now, but it will dry out once all the plants grow up. So Northwest Arkansas Land Trust is a local land conservation nonprofit. We are a 501c3. We're not a governmental organization. We are a local homegrown nonprofit whose mission is to preserve land for all people and for future generations in Northwest Arkansas. The Land Trust currently has almost 5,000 acres under protection right now. The majority of those are through conservation easements, but we do have some properties that we own outright, like Wilson Springs Preserve. On the preserves that we actually own outright, we work to manage and restore them to their natural state in certain circumstances, and also to improve habitat quality in areas that are already in pretty good shape.
While you're walking through the preserve, you might notice bird boxes like this one behind me. There are 12 boxes set up around the property for cavity nesting birds. These birds usually nest in hollow trees or other sheltered enclosures. Because of habitat loss, the birds have fewer available places to nest, so the boxes provide them with breeding sites. Wrens, chickadees, titmice, tree swallows, or bluebirds might use the boxes. Bluebirds used to be a very common species in Arkansas, but in the 1900s, the population plummeted because of several human activities. The main problems were habitat loss because of development and the introduction of non-native house sparrows and starlings. These birds from other countries outcompete the native bluebirds for available nesting sites. By the late 1970s, very few bluebirds were left in Arkansas. Scientists and citizens began placing and maintaining nest boxes for bluebirds, and their numbers have been increasing in the last few decades. Master Naturalist volunteers started maintaining the boxes here at Wilson Springs in 2013. Volunteers check the boxes twice each week throughout the 6-month breeding period. They collect data and send it to Cornell University through a citizen science project called Nest Watch. It is important for the health of the birds that only qualified monitors check the boxes. Too much human activity close to the boxes can negatively impact the birds. Northwest Arkansas Land Trust is working to restore this property to its historic makeup, which provides bluebirds and other species with the open forest and grassland they need.